I had been planning this solo trip into the woods for months, obsessively checking maps, weather reports, and gear lists. I wanted to push myself farther than ever before, to reach a part of the forest few people ever went, where the trees grew so close together that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. I packed carefully. A tent, sleeping bag, water, food, a stove, first aid kit, flashlight, knife, extra clothes, and my phone, even though I knew there would be no service. I wanted this trip to test me, to see if I could handle true isolation in a place where nature controlled everything. I left my car at the edge of a narrow dirt road just as the sky began to lighten with the first hints of sunrise. The air was crisp, cold, and smelled of pine and damp soil. I stepped onto the trail, my boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves, twigs, and scattered rocks. The forest felt different here, older and quieter than anything I had experienced before. Even in the early morning, every step echoed unnaturally, and I realized quickly that this was a place where silence wasn't just the absence of sound. It was something heavier, a weight pressing against your ears and your chest. The first few hours passed with only minor distractions. Birds called to one another, insects buzzed faintly in the underbrush, and I occasionally startled a squirrel or rabbit that scurried into the foliage. I kept a steady pace, sometimes stopping to drink water or check my map, but mostly letting the forest guide me. Every turn of the path, every bend in the creek, became a landmark I memorized, knowing that navigation in this part of the woods required attention and instinct rather than relying on printed trails. By mid-afternoon, I came across a narrow ridge that offered a faint view of the forest below. Sunlight spilled across the tops of the trees, but shadows clung tightly to the undergrowth, hiding hollows and fallen logs in deep darkness. I stopped briefly to catch my breath, wiping sweat from my forehead, and felt a sudden unease. Even though it was daytime, the forest felt as though it were watching, every movement in the leaves or the bending of a branch seeming deliberate. I tried to shake off the feeling, focusing on the trail ahead, but the awareness of being completely alone in such a remote place made my chest tighten. Eventually, I found a small clearing by a creek that looked ideal for camping. It was flat, dry, and had enough room for my tent, with the water nearby in case I needed more later. I set up camp carefully, staking the tent securely and laying out my sleeping bag. I cooked a small meal, savoring the simple warmth and the quiet hum of the creek, and tried to relax. The sun began to sink lower, and the shadows lengthened, creating shapes and patterns that made the forest seem even more alive, almost threatening. Night came quickly, and I crawled into my tent, zipped it tightly, and tried to sleep. That's when I noticed the first sound that didn't belong. The faint scrape of something moving against the forest floor near the creek. At first, I thought it was an animal, but the noise was irregular, deliberate, like someone or something was testing the terrain, listening, watching. My heart raced. I stayed still, gripping my flashlight, trying to listen closely. The sound moved slowly around the clearing, then stopped. The silence that followed was heavier than before, almost tangible. I realized I couldn't stay inside the tent. Panic was rising, but logic forced me to plan carefully. I packed quickly but quietly, leaving behind non-essential items. Extra food, my stove, and some clothes. I grabbed only the essentials: water, flashlight, knife, a small bag of food, and my pack. The night was nearly pitch black, with only the moonlight filtering through the thick canopy, creating faint shadows that shifted with the wind. I started moving, following the creek, hoping it would lead to a known trail or a road. Every step was tense, careful. The forest was a maze of black shapes, roots and rocks hidden by darkness threatening to trip me with every step. The dragging noise never returned, but the feeling of being watched remained, pressing on my mind. My legs began to ache, my lungs burned, and every minor sound, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me freeze. I moved slowly but deliberately, knowing that alertness and caution were my only chance to make it through the night safely. Hours passed. The forest twisted around me in patterns that made it hard to judge distance. At one point, I slipped on a moss-covered rock in the creek, scraping my knee and cutting my hand on jagged bark. The cold water stung, and I paused only long enough to catch my breath and wipe the blood, knowing that stopping too long could be dangerous. I forced myself forward, following the faint trickle of the creek as my guide through the darkness. Eventually, just before dawn, I saw it. A faint dirt road winding through the trees. Relief surged through me, but I was too exhausted to celebrate. Every muscle in my body ached. My backpack felt like it weighed twice as much, and my heart was still racing from adrenaline. I stumbled onto the road, taking deep, steadying breaths, and forced myself to move, following the path that led me gradually toward civilization. By mid-morning, the trees thinned and I saw the familiar sight of my car parked where I had left it. I collapsed against it, hands trembling, breathing ragged. Relief and exhaustion washed over me, but I stayed alert, checking the surrounding woods for movement. The forest had released me, but the memory of the night, the dragging sounds, the shadows, the complete isolation, stayed with me, etched into my mind. The drive home was long and slow. I kept checking the rearview mirror, scanning the forest edges, half expecting something to be following me. Towns gradually appeared, signs of civilization returned, and with each mile, the tension eased. I stopped only once for gas, still cautious, still alert, but the woods were behind me now. At home, I cleaned my cuts and bruises, washed the dirt from my clothes, and reflected on what had happened. There was no magic, no haunting, just the raw reality of isolation in a place where any mistake could be dangerous. The scariest part had been the unknown, the possibility that someone else could be out there, the sheer weight of being alone in a place where help might never come. What saved me was preparation, awareness, and the willingness to act decisively. I kept moving, stayed calm, and trusted my instincts. That trip changed the way I approached the wilderness. I still hike, still explore, but never without careful planning, always aware of escape routes and potential threats. The forest remains a place I love, but I respect it in a way I never did before. The night I spent navigating darkness and uncertainty taught me that survival isn't about luck. It's about preparation, attention, and the courage to keep moving when fear is suffocating. By the end of the weekend, I understood the woods in a new way. Not magical, not haunted, but alive, unpredictable, and unforgiving. Making it back to my car and driving home safely was more than just an ending. It was proof of instinct, endurance, and careful thinking. The lesson I carry with me now is simple. The forest demands respect, awareness, and vigilance, and surviving it is about keeping your wits about you and moving forward, no matter how scared you are. The clarity of that lesson, and the fact that I returned home alive, is the best ending I could have hoped for. I had been planning the trip for months. The idea was simple: a solo weekend hike deep into the national forest, far enough that I wouldn't see another person. I wanted the silence, the kind of emptiness where you could hear your own heartbeat echo against the trees. I packed my bag meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, extra clothes, first aid kit. Everything a hiker like me would consider essential. By mid-morning on a Friday, I was driving toward the trailhead, a narrow dirt road that snaked through miles of dense pine and oak, the sunlight filtering down in golden streaks that danced on the dusty ground. The hike started easy. The trail wound along a gentle slope, patches of moss breaking through the soil, and fallen leaves forming a soft carpet beneath my boots. Birds flitted overhead, and a distant creek gurgled somewhere to my left. I kept a steady pace, my backpack snug, my senses alert to every rustle, every snap of a twig. The further I went, the quieter it became. The city felt like a distant memory, replaced by the smell of wet earth, pine sap, and decaying leaves. By late afternoon, I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. It was perfect, a small flat area near a bend in a river, the water low and slow-moving. I set up my tent carefully, staking it firmly into the soft ground, and laid out my sleeping bag inside. I cooked a simple meal, ate slowly, and watched the sun dip lower, painting the sky with deep oranges and purples. Birds began their final calls, and the forest settled into a heavy hush. That was when I noticed it, a faint, irregular movement in the shadows across the river. At first, I convinced myself it was a deer or a raccoon, maybe a reflection on the water. I tried to ignore it, but my chest tightened. There was something deliberate in the way it moved, not like the random wanderings of an animal. I stayed alert, finishing my meal quickly and cleaning up. As night fell, the forest seemed to grow denser. The rustle of leaves, the snap of small branches, even the creaking of trees in the wind became magnified in the dark. I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and tried to settle down. But sleep came fitfully. Every tiny noise, the brush of wind against the tent, the distant crash of a branch, made me startle awake. Around midnight, I woke again, not fully aware why at first, just with that uneasy sense that something was wrong. Then I heard it, a low, dragging sound, like something heavy being pulled over rocks and sticks, moving deliberately around the edge of my campsite. I stayed still, heart hammering, trying to make sense of it. My mind raced through possibilities. Bear, stray dog, maybe even a wild boar. But the sound was too deliberate, too careful. It wasn't the clumsy shuffle of an animal. It was the slow, cautious movement of something aware of me. I stayed in the tent for what felt like hours, holding my flashlight, barely breathing, listening to the dragging sound circle around me, coming closer at times, retreating at others. The wind shifted, and I caught the faint smell of smoke. Not my stove, nothing I had used. Someone else had been here. Someone had passed through, maybe earlier that day, maybe waiting, hiding. My skin crawled. Eventually, I decided I couldn't just lie there. I had to move. I packed quickly but carefully, trying not to make noise. I left some of my supplies behind, taking only the essentials. Water, a small bag of food, my knife, and my flashlight. I slipped out into the darkness. The forest was a maze of black shapes. The river a silver thread I could hear but barely see. My boots sank into mud in some places, scraped against rocks in others. Every snap of a branch or rustle of leaves made me freeze. I kept moving, following the river upstream, hoping it would lead to another trail or some sign of civilization. Hours passed. My legs ached, my lungs burned, and the flashlight beam bounced off twisted trees and rocks. The dragging sound never came back, but I had the sense of being watched, felt the eyes of someone or something, tracking me in the shadows. I had gone miles, maybe more than I realized, when I finally saw it. The faint orange glow of a fire in the distance. Relief washed over me, but so did caution. I didn't know if it was another camper, someone with ill intent, or just a controlled burn someone had left unattended. I circled around, staying downwind, trying to approach quietly. What I found was a small clearing, a fire pit with fresh wood stacked nearby. Nothing else. No person, no footprints, no sign anyone had been there except the fire and some discarded cans. I stared at it, realizing that whoever had been near my campsite had likely been here too. My mind raced. I decided then that waiting or hiding was too dangerous. I needed to get out of the forest entirely. I turned and started walking parallel to the river, hoping to reach the trailhead by dawn. The night dragged on. The forest seemed endless, the dark thick and suffocating, but I forced myself to keep going, ignoring fatigue and the gnawing fear in my chest. By the first light of morning, I finally stumbled onto a worn dirt road I recognized from my map. My relief was physical, almost painful. I ran toward the trailhead, boots slipping in the mud, heart pounding from exhaustion and adrenaline. When I reached my car, parked exactly where I had left it, I sank into the driver's seat, hands shaking. I drove back slowly, constantly checking the rearview mirror, scanning the trees, certain I had been followed even if I couldn't see anyone. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station 30 miles away, and even then, I didn't feel safe until I was among people. The hum of the highway beneath me, the lights of the town surrounding me. Looking back, I know what saved me was staying calm enough to keep moving and trusting my instincts. I didn't try to investigate the noises or confront whoever or whatever had been near my camp. I left everything I didn't need, moved quietly, and eventually escaped. The forest hadn't been haunted, nor had it been supernatural. It was just wild, unpredictable, and filled with others who might be. The lesson I learned that weekend is one I carry with me every time I hike alone. Nature is beautiful and dangerous in equal measure, and sometimes the scariest thing is not knowing who else is out there in the dark, just beyond the reach of your flashlight, waiting for the next move. By the time I got home, covered in mud, cuts from branches, and mentally drained, I promised myself I would never underestimate the isolation of the wilderness again. That weekend left me shaken, but alive. And sometimes the clarity of survival, the simple act of making it out with your life, is the best ending anyone can hope for. I had always loved the woods, the way they felt alive even in silence, the way the air carried the scent of pine, wet soil, and something older, something permanent. That weekend, I decided to go deeper than I ever had before, into a part of the forest few people bothered to hike. It wasn't a marked trail, just a faint path that disappeared into the thickest part of the woods. I packed my bag carefully: tent, sleeping bag, water, food, first aid kit, flashlight, knife, extra clothes, and double-checked everything before leaving. I wanted this to be a solo trip, a test of my endurance, my awareness, and my instincts. I parked my car at the edge of a dirt road just as the sun was climbing. The forest welcomed me with a quiet that was almost unnatural. My boots crunched against fallen leaves and twigs, the sound sharp in the stillness. Every step forward felt like crossing into another world, one where the rules of civilization didn't apply. The trail was narrow, overgrown in places, lined with trees that towered so high their tops disappeared into the misty light. I had a map, but it didn't show the fine details of this path. I relied on landmarks, the curve of the creek, a large fallen oak, patches of moss, trying to remember them as I walked. Hours passed. I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to drink water or check the map, but mostly moving forward. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Birds disappeared, insects grew louder, and the occasional rustle of a small animal made me tense, heart jumping. I reminded myself that the forest was full of creatures, most of them harmless, and that staying calm was my best defense. By late afternoon, I found a clearing near a bend in the creek. It was flat and dry, perfect for a tent, and the water nearby meant I could refill my bottle if needed. I set up camp carefully, staking the tent into the soft earth and laying my sleeping bag inside. I cooked a small meal, enjoying the silence except for the sound of the creek and the wind rustling through the trees. The sun was low, and shadows began to stretch, painting the forest in a dim, golden light that made every shape seem sharper, every movement more meaningful. As darkness fell, I crawled into my tent, zipped it tightly, and tried to sleep. That's when I first noticed something was wrong. A sound came from the edge of the clearing, a low, dragging noise, like someone pulling something over rocks and sticks. My heart leapt, and I froze, straining my ears. At first, I convinced myself it was an animal, a deer, or maybe a raccoon, but the rhythm of the noise was deliberate, careful. It moved slowly around the perimeter of my campsite, then stopped, leaving only the soft whisper of wind through leaves. I stayed still, trying not to breathe too loudly, my hand on my knife, flashlight within reach. Minutes or maybe hours passed. My mind raced through possibilities. Someone could have been following me. Someone could be nearby, watching, waiting. My logical side told me to stay calm, to assess before acting. But fear was rising like a tide I couldn't hold back. I knew I couldn't stay in the tent all night. I packed quickly but quietly, leaving behind extra food and equipment, taking only the essentials: water, knife, flashlight, some food, and my backpack. I slipped into the darkness, moving along the creek as quietly as I could. The forest was a maze of shapes and shadows, every branch and root a potential obstacle. I tried to stick to the creek, hoping it would lead me to a more familiar trail or a road. The dragging sound never returned, but I felt constantly watched. The air seemed heavier, the darkness pressing closer with every step. My legs burned, my lungs ached, and every fallen branch or stone made me stumble. But I kept moving, knowing that stopping could be dangerous. Hours passed. I lost track of time. The forest twisted and turned, each clearing and bend in the creek looking the same. My flashlight flickered once, sending my heart into my throat, but I forced myself to focus. At one point, I slipped on a moss-covered rock, scraping my knee and cutting my hand on a jagged edge. The cold creek water bit at my skin, but I didn't stop long enough to clean the wound properly. I needed to keep moving. By the first light of dawn, I saw it. The faint outline of a dirt road, almost hidden by overgrown bushes and trees. Relief surged through me, but I was too tired to celebrate. My legs felt like lead, my hands raw from gripping the pack, and my back ached from the weight of the bag and the tension of the night. I stumbled onto the road, taking deep breaths, the cold morning air filling my lungs and shaking some of the fear out of my body. I followed the road slowly, every sense alert, scanning the woods for any sign that I hadn't left the threat behind. Eventually, the trees thinned, the road widened, and I saw the familiar sight of my car parked where I had left it. I collapsed against it, exhausted, my heart still racing, my body trembling from adrenaline and fatigue. I sat there for a long time, letting the car shield me, letting the warmth of the morning sun reach me. When I finally started the engine, I drove slowly, constantly checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see movement in the trees behind me. Mile by mile, the tension eased. The highway appeared, towns, other cars, signs of civilization returning like a bomb on the raw nerves left by the night. I stopped for gas only once, still cautious, still wary, but the forest was behind me now. I made it home in one piece, muddy, scratched, but alive. The next day, I cleaned my cuts and bruises, washed the dirt from my clothes, and reflected on what had happened. There was no supernatural force, no haunting, no magic. The fear had been real, physical, and immediate. The danger came from the unknown, from isolation, from the possibility that someone else could have been out there. What saved me was caution, preparation, and the willingness to act decisively. I stayed alert, kept moving, and relied on my instincts. That trip changed how I approached the wilderness. I still hike, still explore, but never as recklessly, never as far into the unknown alone. I learned to respect the forest, to understand that even the quietest place can hide threats, and that survival depends on awareness and action. The woods remain a place I love, but I remember the night I spent moving through darkness, uncertain of what was near me, and I carry the lesson with me every time I plan another hike. Preparation, vigilance, and the courage to move when fear grips you are the difference between surviving and being consumed by the unknown. By the end of that weekend, I understood the forest in a new way, not as a magical escape, but as a real, living environment with dangers that were as immediate as they were invisible. And surviving it, making it back to my car, back to civilization, felt like more than just an ending. It was a proof of instinct, endurance, and careful planning. A clear reminder that life in the woods demands respect, attention, and constant awareness. I made it home alive, and that clarity, that lesson, was the best ending I could have hoped for. I had been planning this solo trip into the forest for months. I told myself it was about testing my endurance, pushing my limits, and getting completely away from the noise of life. The area I chose was remote, with narrow dirt roads leading to little-used trails. The forest was dense, with massive oaks and pines creating a thick canopy overhead. I packed carefully: tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, first aid kit, extra clothes, flashlight, and a knife. I also carried a small handheld GPS and my phone, though I knew service would be non-existent once I went deep enough. I wanted to go as far as I could, to reach a part of the woods most people avoided. I parked at the trailhead early in the morning. The air was crisp, carrying the smell of damp soil and pine needles. My boots crunched on the carpet of leaves and sticks as I began hiking, the forest pressing in on all sides. Even though the sun was rising, the dense trees cast long shadows, creating patches of near darkness. Every sound, my steps, the rustle of leaves, the distant gurgle of a creek, felt amplified. I reminded myself to stay calm, to pay attention to every detail, and to mark my path mentally in case I needed to retrace my steps. The first few hours were uneventful. Birds called overhead, a few squirrels darted across branches, and I occasionally startled a rabbit into the underbrush. The trail was faint, often disappearing under fallen leaves and moss, forcing me to rely on my instincts to follow the natural curves of the land. I paused occasionally to drink water, eat a snack, and take in the forest around me. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The birds' calls faded, insects became the dominant sound, and the wind through the trees felt heavier, carrying a faint scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. By late afternoon, I came to a clearing near a creek. It was flat and dry, with enough space to pitch my tent and a nearby stream for water. I set up camp carefully, staking my tent into the soft soil and laying my sleeping bag inside. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, eating slowly while watching the sunlight filter through the trees, painting the forest floor in long shadows. As the sun sank lower, the forest changed. Colors dimmed, shapes grew darker, and every movement in the shadows seemed more pronounced. I could feel the isolation settling into my chest like a weight. Night arrived faster than I expected. I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and tried to sleep. That's when I heard it. A low, deliberate scraping noise near the edge of the clearing. My heart jumped, and I froze. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or deer, but the rhythm was deliberate, careful. It moved around the perimeter of my camp, then stopped. I lay still, holding my flashlight in my hand, ears straining for the smallest sound. The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating, and I realized that someone, or something, was aware of me. I stayed in the tent for a long time, considering my options. Panic rose, but I forced myself to think clearly. Staying put felt dangerous. Leaving meant venturing into complete darkness with an unknown threat. I decided I had no choice but to move. I packed quickly and quietly, leaving behind non-essential items. Extra food, my stove, some clothes, and took only the essentials. Water, flashlight, knife, small bag of food, and my backpack. Slipping into the darkness, I moved along the creek. The forest was almost pitch black, with only faint moonlight piercing the canopy. Every root, rock, and fallen branch threatened to trip me. The dragging noise never returned, but I felt eyes on me, the sense of being watched pressing against my skin. I forced myself to keep moving, focusing on the sound of the creek as a guide. My legs ached, my hands burned from gripping the straps of my backpack, and my heart raced in a way that made it hard to breathe. Every sound, the snap of a branch, rustling leaves, made me freeze, listening intently before moving again. Hours passed. The forest twisted in confusing patterns. Every clearing looked the same, every bend in the creek seemed identical. At one point, I slipped on moss-covered rocks, scraping my hands and knees on jagged bark and wet stones. The cold creek water stung, and I pressed on, refusing to stop for long. The night stretched endlessly, and I could feel exhaustion creeping into every muscle. My mind began to focus only on one thought: move, survive, reach safety. As dawn approached, I finally saw it. The faint outline of a dirt road winding through the trees. Relief surged through me, but I was far too exhausted to celebrate. My legs burned, my back ached, and my hands were raw from gripping my backpack all night. I stumbled onto the road, taking deep breaths, letting the cool morning air fill my lungs. The road led slowly upward, winding through the thinning trees, until eventually I spotted the familiar sight of my car parked at the edge of the forest. I collapsed against it, trembling, breathing in short, ragged gasps, my body trembling from adrenaline, exhaustion, and relief. I sat there for a long time, scanning the forest edges, aware that the woods had released me, but my mind remained alert. Slowly, I regained enough composure to start the engine and drive away. The road eventually led to pavement. Towns appeared, traffic returned, and with each mile the tension in my shoulders eased. I stopped only once for gas, still alert, still scanning the edges of the forest, but the night was behind me now. When I finally returned home, I cleaned the cuts on my hands and knees, washed the dirt from my clothes, and reflected on the experience. The forest had been beautiful, but it had also been dangerous. There was no supernatural force, just isolation, darkness, and the possibility of unknown threats. The fear I felt was real, immediate, and physical. Survival had depended on careful planning, constant attention, and the willingness to act decisively when needed. I had trusted my instincts, kept moving, and made it through a night that could have ended badly if I had panicked or hesitated. That weekend taught me more about respect for nature than any guidebook ever could. I still hike and explore, but I plan meticulously, carry essentials, and avoid taking unnecessary risks. The forest is alive, unpredictable, and unforgiving, and I now understand that the scariest parts are not myths or legends. They are real, tangible, and immediate. Survival is about awareness, preparation, and action, not luck. By the time I reached home, exhausted, muddy, scratched, and mentally drained, I knew that I had survived because I had stayed calm, relied on my instincts, and moved forward despite fear. The lesson was clear. The woods demand respect, caution, and constant vigilance. Making it back alive wasn't just an ending. It was a proof of endurance, awareness, and clear thinking. That clarity, that sense of survival, was the best ending I could hope for, and it is a lesson I carry with me every time I plan another hike into the wilderness. I had always wanted to climb that mountain, not the famous peaks everyone photographs, but the smaller, rugged one hidden behind dense forests and winding dirt roads, the one locals warned about because it was easy to get lost and the weather could change without warning. I wanted the challenge, the solitude, the feeling of being on my own with nothing between me and the raw wilderness. I spent weeks planning, studying maps, checking weather patterns, packing everything I thought I might need. My pack was heavy with essentials: tent, sleeping bag, water, food, stove, first aid kit, knife, flashlight, extra clothes, and climbing gear. I also brought my GPS and my phone, knowing full well they might not work at all once I got far enough. I arrived at the trailhead just as the first light of dawn was breaking. The air was crisp, sharp, carrying the smell of pine, wet soil, and stone. My boots sank slightly into the soft ground, crunching over a thin layer of leaves and broken twigs. The forest loomed on all sides, thick with trees that rose higher than I could see. Even in the morning light, it felt shadowed, heavy, almost like the trees themselves were watching. I set off slowly, steadying my pack and paying attention to every detail. The curve of the trail, the rise of the land, small markers I could use to find my way back if needed. The first few hours were uneventful, almost peaceful. Birds called to each other in the canopy, squirrels scurried across the branches, and an occasional rabbit darted into the underbrush. I focused on maintaining a steady pace, occasionally stopping to drink water or check the map. The trail was faint in places, covered with fallen leaves and moss, forcing me to follow the natural curves of the mountain and read the subtle signs in the terrain. The higher I climbed, the quieter it became. Birds disappeared, insects grew louder, and the wind through the trees seemed heavier, carrying with it the smell of damp rock and earth. By mid-afternoon, I had reached a narrow ridge that gave a partial view of the valley below. The sun illuminated the distant mountains, but shadows clung to the crevices and dense forest. It was beautiful, but the solitude began to feel heavier. Every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig made my heart race. I reminded myself that fear was natural in isolation, that staying calm and alert was my best defense. I pushed forward, climbing higher, my legs burning with exertion and my breath coming in ragged bursts. Eventually, I found a small, flat spot halfway up the mountain, just above a steep incline. It was ideal for a temporary camp. I set up my tent carefully, staked it into the soil, and laid out my sleeping bag. I cooked a small meal on my stove, the scent of rice and beans mixing with the crisp mountain air. I watched the sun sink lower, painting the distant peaks in red and gold. Shadows grew long and sharp, and the forest seemed to tighten around me. I could feel the isolation pressing in, the kind that makes your own heartbeat sound deafening in the still air. Night came faster than I expected. I crawled into my tent, zipped it tightly, and tried to sleep, but the mountain had other plans. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of rocks shifting somewhere downhill, a distant scraping that echoed faintly up the slope. At first, I thought it might be a small landslide, but the noise was irregular, almost deliberate. My chest tightened. I lay perfectly still, gripping my flashlight and knife, trying to pinpoint the source. The sound moved slowly, pausing, then starting again, like something was navigating the terrain carefully, testing its footing. I realized staying in the tent was dangerous. Panic surged, but I forced myself to think clearly. I packed quickly but quietly, leaving non-essential items, my stove, extra food, and clothes behind. I took only the essentials: water, knife, flashlight, and my pack. The mountain was dark and cold, with only a sliver of moonlight illuminating jagged rocks and twisted roots. I began moving, staying close to the ridge and avoiding the steepest drops. Every step was careful, deliberate. A misstep could be fatal. Hours passed. The mountain twisted around me like a labyrinth. The scraping sound never returned, but the sense of being watched lingered, pressing against my mind. I slipped once on loose rock, scraping my hands and forearms on the rough surface, the cold air stinging the cuts. I pressed on, knowing that stopping too long could be dangerous, both physically and mentally. My legs burned, my lungs screamed for air, and my mind wavered between fear and determination. I forced myself to focus on the next step, the next rock, the next foothold. As the first light of dawn crept over the peaks, I spotted it, the faint outline of a dirt road winding through the forest below. Relief surged through me, but exhaustion made every movement difficult. I descended slowly, cautiously, aware that one wrong step could undo everything. My legs were stiff, my hands raw, and my body screamed from fatigue, but I pressed on, guided by the promise of safety. Eventually, the forest thinned, and the road became clearer. I stumbled onto it, collapsing against a tree to catch my breath. The air smelled less like damp earth and stone and more like morning, crisp and clean. I followed the road gradually downward, each step bringing me closer to civilization. By mid-morning, I saw the familiar sight of my car parked at the edge of the forest. I sank into it, exhausted, trembling, and breathed deeply, listening to the normal sounds of the world: the wind, birds, and distant cars. The mountain was behind me, dark and silent, its dangers now a memory. The drive home was slow. Every curve in the road made me tense. Every shadow in the trees made me glance twice. But gradually, towns appeared, the hum of traffic returned, and with each mile the tension eased. At home, I cleaned my wounds, soaked in a hot shower, and reflected on the experience. The mountain had been unforgiving but real. No magic, no hauntings, just isolation, risk, and the consequences of being unprepared. The fear had been real, physical, immediate, and it had taught me more about respect for nature than any guidebook could. Survival had depended on preparation, awareness, and the courage to act decisively. I trusted my instincts, stayed calm, and moved carefully through a situation that could have ended badly if I had hesitated or panicked. The mountain taught me that the wilderness is unforgiving, that danger is often invisible, and that the scariest moments are the ones that are entirely real. From that day on, I approached every hike differently. I never ventured into remote mountains without careful planning, always bringing essentials, checking weather, and leaving a clear plan with someone at home. I learned to respect the isolation, the unpredictability, and the sheer difficulty of such terrain. Survival isn't about luck. It's about awareness, preparation, and keeping moving, even when fear is suffocating. By the time I had returned home, exhausted, muddy, scratched, and mentally drained, I realized the lesson the mountain had given me was clear. Making it back alive wasn't just an ending. It was a confirmation that preparation, awareness, and persistence can overcome isolation and danger. That clarity, the proof that I had survived the mountain on my own, was the best ending I could hope for. The fear I had felt stayed with me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I could handle it, that I had navigated the mountain carefully, and that I had come home alive. I had been planning this hike for weeks, maybe months, though I kept telling myself it was only a weekend trip. I wanted to go deeper into the woods than I ever had before, to find a place where the forest swallowed everything. The sound of roads, the hum of cities, the faint glow of civilization. The trailhead I chose was far off a dirt road, a place that only locals knew, where the paths were barely marked and the forest grew dense and old. I packed carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, food, water, stove, first aid kit, flashlight, extra clothes, and a knife. I brought my phone, though I knew it would likely have no service once I went far enough, and a small GPS unit for emergencies. I told myself I wanted solitude and challenge, but deep down, I think I was also drawn to the unknown, the kind of fear you can only feel when you are completely alone. I started walking just after sunrise. The air was crisp, sharp, carrying the smell of wet leaves, pine, and earth. My boots sank slightly in the soft soil, making small crunches as I stepped. The forest rose all around me, thick with oaks and pines that stretched high into the sky, their tops disappearing into the early morning mist. The trail was faint, covered in fallen leaves, moss, and scattered rocks, and in places I had to make small decisions about which direction to follow, trusting the subtle curves of the terrain and the alignment of the creek that ran nearby. The forest was quiet, too quiet, and the silence pressed against me, making every small sound, my own breathing, the rustle of leaves, the distant crash of a branch, feel magnified. The first few hours passed uneventfully, though I stayed alert, scanning the trees and undergrowth for signs of animals or hazards. Birds called from the canopy, squirrels darted across branches, and I startled a rabbit more than once. The deeper I went, the more isolated it became. Birdsong disappeared, replaced by the steady hum of insects and the faint gurgle of the creek. The trail became less distinct, forcing me to rely on landmarks. A large fallen oak, a patch of moss, the way the ground sloped toward the creek. I kept checking my GPS and my map, careful not to wander too far off course. By mid-afternoon, I found a small clearing near the creek that looked perfect for camping. It was flat, dry, and offered enough space to pitch my tent safely. I set it up carefully, anchoring it into the soil, and laid out my sleeping bag. I cooked a small meal, eating slowly while watching the sun move through the trees, casting long shadows on the forest floor. The shadows grew as the sun lowered, and the woods felt different, heavier, darker, almost oppressive. Every sound, every shifting branch seemed sharper, more deliberate. I reminded myself to stay calm. This was the woods. The forest was alive with sounds I didn't always understand. Night came faster than I expected. I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and tried to sleep. That's when I first heard it. A scraping sound, low and irregular, coming from the edge of the clearing. My heart jumped. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but the sound was deliberate, careful, like someone or something was testing the ground, moving slowly around the perimeter of my campsite. My chest tightened. I lay still, gripping my flashlight, trying to listen closely. The silence that followed the noise was heavier than anything I had felt before, almost suffocating. I realized staying inside the tent might be dangerous. Panic rose, but I forced myself to think clearly. I packed quickly but quietly, leaving behind items I didn't need immediately: extra food, stove, and clothes. I took only the essentials: water, my knife, flashlight, and small backpack. The night was nearly pitch black, with only faint moonlight piercing the canopy and illuminating twisted roots and jagged rocks. I moved carefully along the creek, using it as a guide. Every footstep was deliberate, every root and rock considered. A single misstep could be catastrophic in the darkness. Hours passed. The scraping sound never returned, but the sense of being watched stayed with me. The forest twisted and turned, making it impossible to judge distance. At one point, I slipped on a moss-covered rock and cut my hands and knees on jagged bark and stones. The cold creek water bit at my skin, and I forced myself to keep moving, refusing to stop for long. My legs burned, my back ached from the pack, and my heart pounded in a rhythm that made me dizzy. But I focused only on the next step, the next movement, staying as quiet and cautious as possible. As dawn approached, I finally saw it. A faint dirt road winding through the forest. Relief surged through me, but exhaustion made each step a challenge. My legs were stiff, my hands raw, and my body screamed from fatigue, but I pressed on, guided by the promise of safety. I stumbled onto the road and paused, leaning on my knees to catch my breath, listening to the normal morning sounds. Birds calling, the wind rustling through leaves, distant water flowing. It felt like the first time in hours that the forest had not been pressing in, and I felt a brief, almost overwhelming sense of safety. I followed the road gradually downward, careful with each step, until eventually I saw the familiar sight of my car parked at the edge of the forest. I collapsed against it, trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline, breathing in deep, ragged breaths. Relief washed over me, but I stayed alert, scanning the trees for any movement. The forest had released me, but the memory of the night, the scraping sounds, the shadows, the complete isolation, stayed with me, etched into my mind. The drive home was long and slow. Every curve in the road made me tense. Every shadow in the trees made me glance twice. Gradually, civilization returned. Towns appeared, traffic, the hum of engines, and the tension began to ease. I stopped once for gas, still alert, still cautious, but I was no longer in immediate danger. By the time I reached home, I was muddy, scratched, and mentally drained. Cleaning myself, tending to cuts, and reflecting, I realized the woods had taught me a clear lesson. There was no supernatural force, no haunting, only the reality of isolation and potential danger. Survival depended entirely on awareness, preparation, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. I had trusted my instincts, stayed calm, and moved carefully, which is what kept me alive. The forest was unforgiving, but it had also been a teacher, showing me the value of caution, respect, and vigilance. Since that trip, I have never hiked alone into remote woods without careful preparation. I always carry essentials, always plan escape routes, and I approach isolation with a respect born of experience. The woods are alive, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifying, but they are not magical. They are real, and the risks are tangible. Survival is not about luck. It is about attention, preparation, and action. By the time I had fully recovered, I understood the lesson clearly. The ending that mattered most was not simply reaching home, but the knowledge that I had navigated danger, managed fear, and emerged intact. That clarity, that proof of my instincts and endurance, was the most important part of the story. I survived because I stayed aware, stayed calm, and kept moving when every instinct screamed to freeze. That weekend in the woods will stay with me forever, a reminder of how fragile safety can be, and how careful planning, attention, and courage can make the difference between disaster and survival. I had been planning this trip for weeks, not a casual hike or a short overnight camping trip, but a true venture into the deep woods, an area so remote that few people went there, where the trees grew thick and tall, and the trails were little more than faint dirt paths winding through dense undergrowth. I told myself I wanted solitude, to push myself, to experience the forest in its rawest, most isolated form. I packed carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, water, food, first aid kit, flashlight, knife, extra clothes, and my phone, even though I knew it would be useless far into the wilderness. I also brought a small GPS, a backup map, and a compass. I wanted to be prepared for everything, because I knew that once I stepped off the main trail, I was completely on my own. I left my car at the end of a narrow dirt road just as the sun began to rise, spilling golden light across the edges of the forest. The air was cold, carrying the scent of pine, damp earth, and moss. My boots sank into the soft ground, making the dry crunch of leaves and twigs sound unnaturally loud. The forest rose around me, dense and silent, as if it had been waiting for me to enter. I started down the trail slowly, taking careful steps over roots and rocks, scanning for the small signs that indicated I was still on a passable path. An unusual break in the underbrush, a distant curve of a creek, a tree marked with faded orange paint. The first few hours were uneventful, almost peaceful. Birds called from the treetops, squirrels scurried across branches, and once or twice, a rabbit darted through the undergrowth, startling me. I drank water, checked my map, and adjusted my pack straps, enjoying the solitude and the sounds of the forest. But as I climbed higher and the forest grew thicker, the atmosphere began to change. The birds stopped calling. The wind became more noticeable, moving through the trees with a whisper that made the branches creak. Even the creek, which had been a steady companion, sounded quieter, more distant. By mid-afternoon, I reached a small clearing beside a narrow stream. The ground was flat and dry, ideal for camping, and the water would allow me to refill my bottle. I set up my tent carefully, anchoring it into the soil, and laid out my sleeping bag. I cooked a simple meal on my small stove, letting the warmth and aroma settle around me. The sun sank lower, filtering through the canopy in long beams that illuminated patches of the forest floor while leaving the rest in darkness. Shadows stretched unnaturally, and I felt the first real weight of isolation pressing down. The forest no longer felt alive in a gentle way, it felt aware. Night came faster than I expected. I crawled into my tent, zipped it closed, and tried to sleep, but my mind refused to rest. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint, irregular scraping coming from the edge of my clearing. My heart leapt. At first, I tried to rationalize it. A deer or a raccoon, perhaps, but the rhythm was deliberate, cautious, and the sound seemed to circle the campsite. My breath caught, my chest tightened, and for the first time since entering the forest, I felt genuinely vulnerable. The silence that followed the scraping was heavier than the noise itself, a pressing, almost physical presence that seemed to hang in the air around me. I realized I couldn't stay in the tent. Panic rose, but I forced myself to think clearly. I packed quickly but quietly, leaving behind items I could do without. Extra food, my stove, even some clothes. I took only the essentials: water, flashlight, knife, and my small backpack. The forest was nearly pitch black, moonlight barely piercing the thick canopy, casting strange, shifting shadows. I moved cautiously along the creek, using the sound of running water as a guide. Every step was deliberate. Roots and rocks threatened to trip me, and I kept my flashlight sweeping in front of me to catch the most obvious hazards. Hours passed. The scraping sound never returned, but the sensation of being watched stayed with me, pressing against my mind and forcing my eyes to scan constantly. The creek twisted and turned, and the forest seemed to warp, every corner looking the same, every tree indistinguishable. I slipped once on a moss-covered rock, scraping my hands and forearms on the jagged bark, and the cold creek water stung sharply. I pressed on, knowing that stopping for long would leave me vulnerable and risk losing momentum. My legs burned, my lungs heaved, my back ached from the pack, but I kept moving. Eventually, as the first light of dawn began to spill over the trees, I spotted something familiar, the faint outline of a dirt road winding through the forest. Relief surged through me, but I was far too tired to celebrate. My legs felt like lead, my hands were raw, and every movement required deliberate effort. I followed the road slowly, cautiously, taking advantage of the clearer path to make up some distance while still staying alert. The sounds of the forest began to shift. Birds returned, the wind moved gently, and the oppressive weight of the night lifted slightly. By mid-morning, I finally saw the edge of the forest where I had left my car. I collapsed against it, shaking with exhaustion and adrenaline, breathing in deep, ragged breaths. Relief washed over me, but I stayed alert, scanning the trees around me. The woods had released me, but the memory of the night, the scraping sounds, the shadows, the weight of isolation, remained vivid in my mind. The drive home was slow and careful. Every curve in the road, every tree-lined section made me tense, but gradually civilization returned. Towns appeared, other cars, signs of life, and with every mile, the tension in my body eased. I stopped only once for gas, still cautious, still scanning the edges of the forest, but the danger felt distant now. When I reached home, I cleaned my cuts and bruises, soaked in a hot shower, and reflected on the experience. The forest had been real and dangerous, not magical or haunted, but isolating, unforgiving, and unpredictable. The scariest part was not imagination. It was physical, immediate, and unavoidable. Survival depended entirely on preparation, awareness, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. I had trusted my instincts, stayed calm, and moved carefully, which is what allowed me to make it through a night that could have ended in disaster. From that weekend forward, I approached the wilderness differently. I still hike, still explore, but never without careful planning, essentials, and awareness of potential dangers. I learned to respect isolation, unpredictability, and the raw power of nature. Survival is not about luck. It is about attention, preparation, and action. By the time I was fully rested and reflecting on the trip, I understood the lesson clearly. The ending that mattered most wasn't simply reaching home. It was knowing I had survived, navigated danger, and emerged intact. That clarity, that confirmation of awareness and endurance, was the true ending. I survived because I kept moving, stayed alert, and trusted my instincts. The memory of the forest stayed with me, but it was tempered by the knowledge that I could handle it, that I had navigated darkness, isolation, and fear, and I had come home alive.